The rain turned the city streets into mirrors of neon and desperation, each droplet carrying the weight of decisions that could not be undone. Zara Matthews pressed her back against the cold brick wall of the alley, her breathing sharp and shallow as footsteps echoed somewhere in the maze of downtown Portland behind her. The bruise along her left cheek throbbed in rhythm with her racing heart, a cruel reminder of why running through these unfamiliar streets at midnight had become her only option. Whether you are watching this from the safety of your own home tonight, or perhaps during a quiet moment at work, take a moment to think about the spaces that make you feel truly secure. Sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is stay where we know we do not belong, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight, because this story is about finding sanctuary in the most unlikely arms. She clutched her purse against her chest, the only thing she had managed to grab before Marcus had returned home earlier than expected, his eyes already glazed with the particular combination of alcohol and rage that meant her careful plans meant nothing. 3 months of secretly saving money, of researching shelters, of building the courage to finally leave, and it had all collapsed in the space of a heartbeat when his key turned in the lock 2 hours ahead of schedule. The sound of her name being called in the distance made her muscles tense like a trapped animal. Marcus had always been relentless when he hunted, whether it was tracking down a promotion at work or ensuring she understood exactly why she could never leave him. His voice carried that familiar edge of controlled violence, the same tone he used when explaining why she had made him hurt her, why it was really her fault that his hands had found her throat again. Zara pushed away from the wall and moved deeper into the maze of upscale restaurants and boutique shops that marked this part of the city. The rain had driven most sensible people indoors, leaving only the desperate and the dangerous to navigate the slick sidewalks. Her sneakers made soft splashing sounds against the pavement as she tried to stay in the shadows, tried to become invisible in a world that had never offered her that luxury. The warm glow spilling from the windows of Hannock caught her attention like a lighthouse in a storm. The Korean characters above the door meant nothing to her, but the soft amber light promised warmth and witnesses, 2 things that might keep her alive long enough to figure out her next move. She had no plan beyond survival, no destination except away, but the elegant restaurant seemed to offer at least a temporary reprieve from the hunt. She slipped through the front door, her wet clothes immediately out of place among the understated luxury of dark wood and carefully arranged flowers. The hostess looked up with polite confusion, clearly recognizing that Zara did not belong in this world of quiet wealth and refined taste. Before either of them could speak, the sound of the front door opening again sent ice through Zara's veins. Panic overrode reason. She pushed past the hostess stand and fled deeper into the restaurant, following a narrow hallway that led away from the main dining room. Her wet shoes left tracks on the polished hardwood as she searched desperately for a back exit, for any escape route that would keep her away from Marcus and his promises of what he would do when he found her. The door she chose opened onto a scene that made her breath catch in her throat. 3 men sat around a low table in what was clearly a private dining room, their conversation stopping the moment she stumbled into their space. The air held the lingering scent of expensive whiskey and something else, something darker that spoke of power and controlled violence. The man who commanded the room did not need to be introduced. He was a study in understated menace, his black suit tailored with the kind of precision that whispered of serious money and serious consequences. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his eyes held the sort of cold intelligence that missed nothing and forgave less. When he looked at her, Zara felt the weight of absolute authority, the presence of someone accustomed to having his word become law through methods she probably did not want to understand. Jin Woo Kim regarded the trembling woman who had invaded his private meeting with the same analytical calm he brought to all unexpected developments. She was beautiful in a natural, unguarded way that stood in sharp contrast to the calculated perfection of the women who usually sought his attention. Her dark skin glistened with rainwater, and the fear in her brown eyes was genuine, immediate, and directed at something behind her rather than at him. This was not an assassination attempt or a business rival's clumsy gambit. This was a prey animal who had stumbled into the wrong predator's territory while fleeing from another hunt entirely. "What are you running from?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected answers immediately and completely. The question was not an offer of help but an assessment of threat, a calculation of whether her presence represented a problem that needed to be eliminated or managed. Before she could answer, the door behind her exploded inward with a violence that made the restaurant's carefully maintained atmosphere shatter like glass. Marcus filled the doorway like a storm front, his face flushed with exertion and fury, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Zara with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his quarry. "There you are," Marcus snarled, his voice thick with the entitled rage of a man who had never been denied anything he claimed as his own. "You think you can run from me? You think hiding in some fancy restaurant is going to save you from what you have coming?" The transformation in Jin Woo was subtle but absolute. The polite inquiry in his eyes hardened into something that would have made seasoned killers step carefully. He did not move from his seated position, did not raise his voice, but his presence expanded to fill the room like a gathering storm. The two men flanking him shifted almost imperceptibly, their hands moving to positions that suggested weapons were within easy reach. "This is a private establishment," Jin Woo said, his voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "You are disturbing my dinner." Marcus barely glanced at him, his attention focused entirely on Zara as he stepped into the room. His hands were already reaching for her when Jin Woo's expression shifted into something that belonged in nightmares. A single gesture from the seated man brought his associates to their feet with the fluid precision of predators who had done this dance many times before. The violence was over before Marcus fully understood what was happening. One moment he was reaching for Zara with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences, and the next he was pressed face first against the wall with his arm twisted at an angle that spoke of imminent breakage. The larger of Jin Woo's men held him there with casual efficiency, while the other stood ready to provide whatever additional persuasion might be required. Jin Woo finally rose from his seat with the unhurried grace of absolute power. He approached Marcus with the measured steps of someone conducting a business transaction, his expression betraying nothing more dangerous than mild annoyance at the interruption to his evening. "You have made several errors in judgment tonight," Jin Woo observed, his voice maintaining that same conversational tone despite the violence humming in the air around them. "You have brought your domestic problems into my establishment. You have threatened a woman under my roof. And you have shown me disrespect in front of my associates." He paused directly in front of Marcus, close enough that his next words would be impossible to misunderstand. "These are not mistakes that I typically allow men to repeat." The whimpered plea that escaped Marcus's lips was nothing like the commanding voice that had terrorized Zara for months. Faced with real power, real consequence, the bully revealed himself to be nothing more than a coward who had never learned the difference between cruelty and strength. Jin Woo turned his attention back to Zara, who stood frozen in the center of the room like a deer caught between two different types of predator. The fear in her eyes had not diminished, but it had changed quality. She was beginning to understand that she had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple escape route. "You have a choice to make," Jin Woo said, his voice returning to that same measured calm that somehow made him more terrifying than Marcus had ever been in his rage. "You can leave with him, and whatever happens afterward will be between the two of you. Or you can accept my protection, with all that such an arrangement would entail." The words hung in the air like a contract written in invisible ink, full of implications that Zara's exhausted mind struggled to process. She looked at Marcus, still pinned against the wall and whimpering, then back at Jin Woo, whose dark eyes held depths she could not begin to fathom. One choice led back to familiar hell. The other led into unknown territory with a man who controlled violence like other people controlled their breathing. She thought of the months of planning that had led her here, of the careful savings account Marcus had never discovered, of the shelter applications she had filled out in secret. All of that careful preparation had crumbled in a single evening, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a stranger's offer of protection that felt more like a beautifully wrapped trap. "I accept," she whispered, the words leaving her lips before her rational mind could intervene. The moment she spoke them, she felt something fundamental shift in the room, as if the very air had changed to accommodate a new reality. Jinwoo nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both satisfaction and warning. The decision had been made, but Zara was beginning to understand that accepting the protection of a man like Jinwoo Kim was not the end of her problems. It was merely the beginning of an entirely different kind of danger, one that would test everything she thought she knew about power, control, and the thin line between sanctuary and captivity. Marcus was removed from the restaurant with the same efficient brutality that had subdued him, disappearing into the rainy night with warnings that would ensure he never came looking for her again. But as Zara stood in the sudden quiet of the private dining room, watching Jinwoo return to his seat with predatory grace, she realized that her real education was just beginning. The storm outside continued to rage, but she was no longer running through it alone. She had found shelter, but shelter with a dragon was still a dragon's lair. And she was beginning to understand that the most dangerous cages were often the ones that felt like salvation. The silence that followed Marcus's removal felt heavier than the storm outside, weighted with implications that Zara's exhausted mind struggled to process. Jinwoo settled back into his chair with the fluid grace of a man who had just resolved a minor inconvenience rather than orchestrated an act of calculated violence. His associates resumed their positions at the table as if the interruption had been nothing more than a waiter delivering the wrong order. "Sit," Jinwoo commanded quietly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "We have business to discuss." The word business carried undertones that made Zara's stomach clench with new anxiety. She remained standing, her wet clothes still dripping onto the polished floor, suddenly aware that accepting his protection had been only the first move in a game whose rules she did not understand. The fear that had driven her through the rainy streets was being replaced by a different kind of unease, the growing realization that she had escaped one trap only to find herself in another. "I should go," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I can handle this myself. Call the police, get a restraining order, find a shelter. There are proper channels for situations like this." Jinwoo's expression did not change, but something shifted in his dark eyes, a flicker of what might have been amusement at her naivety. He leaned back in his chair and studied her with the focused attention of a predator evaluating prey, taking in details that most people would miss. "Marcus Townsend," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. 34 years old. Works as a district manager for Pacific Northwest Logistics. Lives in the Hawthorne District apartment you shared for 8 months. Has a gambling problem that has put him in debt to some very unpleasant people who are not particularly concerned with legal niceties when collecting what they are owed. Each word hit Zara like a physical blow. The casual way Jinwoo recited facts about her life, details she had never shared with him, demonstrated a reach in knowledge that made her previous understanding of power seem childishly simple. She had not told him Marcus's name, had not mentioned where they lived or anything about his problems. Yet this stranger knew things that even she had only suspected. "How do you," she began, then stopped, realizing that asking how he knew was far less important than understanding why he was telling her. "Your ex-boyfriend's debts have made him desperate," Jinwoo continued, his voice maintaining that same conversational tone that somehow made the information more terrifying. "Desperate enough to make deals with people who view women as negotiable assets. The police report you file will be processed in 3 to 5 business days. The restraining order you request will be granted in 2 weeks, assuming the judge is feeling cooperative. Marcus and his new associates will not wait that long." The room seemed to shrink around Zara as the full scope of her situation became clear. She had been running from what she thought was a domestic violence problem, something terrible but contained, manageable through proper channels and established systems. Instead, she had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous, a web of debt and desperation that had turned her from a victim into a commodity. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Fear was being replaced by a different emotion, a cold clarity that came from finally understanding the true dimensions of the trap she was in. "Protection," Jinwoo replied simply. "Complete, absolute protection. You will stay at my compound in the West Hills. You will follow security protocols established by my people. You will not leave without escort. You will not contact friends, family, or former associates without clearance. In exchange, you will be safe from Marcus, from his creditors, and from anyone else who might view you as a means to an end. The terms of the arrangement fell between them like chains, each condition another link in a cage that would be gilded but no less restrictive than the one she had just escaped. Zara felt the weight of the choice before her, the terrible mathematics of survival that offered safety at the cost of freedom. "And if I refuse," she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then you are free to walk out that door and handle your situation through whatever means you see fit," Jinwoo said with a slight shrug. "My involvement in your affairs will end the moment you leave this room. What happens afterward will not be my concern." The politeness of his tone could not disguise the reality of the choice he was offering. Accept his protection and surrender her autonomy, or walk back into the storm knowing that Marcus and his new allies would be waiting with patience that outlasted restraining orders and police response times. "I need time to think," Zara said, grasping for some measure of control over a situation that seemed determined to spiral beyond her ability to manage. "Time is a luxury that your circumstances do not afford," Jinwoo replied, checking an expensive watch that probably cost more than Zara made in several months. "Marcus was released from custody 20 minutes ago with a warning about disturbing the peace. His first phone call will be to explain his failure to retrieve you. His second will be to request additional resources for the task. You have perhaps 2 hours before this becomes significantly more complicated." The casual way he delivered this information, as if he had access to police databases and criminal communications in real time, reinforced the demonstration of his reach. This was not a man who made offers of protection lightly or without the means to follow through on his promises. It was also not a man who would accept refusal gracefully or allow her to simply disappear back into her former life. "What guarantees do I have?" Zara asked, fighting to maintain some semblance of negotiating position. "How do I know that your protection will not become something worse than what I am running from?" Jinwoo's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something beneath the controlled surface, something that might have been understanding or even respect for her attempt to establish boundaries. "You have my word," he said simply, as if that should be sufficient guarantee against any possible abuse of the power she would be placing in his hands. The weight of decision pressed down on her like a physical force. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about accepting protection from a man who clearly operated outside the law, who commanded violence with the casual efficiency of someone who had never learned to doubt his own authority. But the alternatives were becoming clearer by the moment, and none of them offered anything resembling safety or hope. "I accept," she said finally, the words carrying the same finality as a signature on a contract written in terms she could not fully comprehend. Jinwoo nodded once, the gesture somehow managing to convey both satisfaction and a warning that the easy part of their arrangement was now over. He spoke briefly to his associates in rapid Korean, words that carried the crisp efficiency of orders being issued and acknowledged. "My driver will take you to collect whatever belongings you require," he said, returning his attention to Zara. "You have 30 minutes to gather essential items. Everything else will be replaced as needed." The casual dismissal of her possessions, her life, her entire existence before this moment stung more than she had expected. But the alternative to accepting his control was a return to chaos that would likely end with her disappearance becoming another unsolved case in an overworked police department's filing system. As they left the restaurant, Zara caught her reflection in the darkened windows and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. 6 hours ago she had been planning her escape from an abusive relationship. Now she was climbing into the back of a luxury sedan driven by a man who spoke in respectful monosyllables and wore his suit like armor, heading toward a compound owned by someone whose protection felt indistinguishable from captivity. The city lights blurred past the rain-streaked windows as they drove through streets she might never navigate freely again. She had traded one cage for another, but as the sedan climbed into the hills above Portland, she began to understand that some cages were designed not to keep you prisoner, but to keep the world's predators from reaching you. The compound gates closed behind them with the soft finality of a choice that could not be unmade, and Zara realized that her real education in power and protection was just beginning. 3 days in Jinwoo's compound had taught Zara that luxury could be its own form of prison. The guest suite assigned to her was larger than the entire apartment she had shared with Marcus, furnished with understated elegance that spoke of serious money and impeccable taste. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city below, but the glass was bulletproof and the windows did not open. Beautiful bars were still bars, no matter how expensive the gilding. Her morning routine had become a careful navigation of boundaries she was still learning to identify. Breakfast was served in a dining room that could have seated 20, but usually held only her and whatever security personnel Jin Woo deemed necessary for her protection. The staff treated her with polite deference, neither friendly nor hostile, simply professional in the way that suggested they had been given very specific instructions about how to interact with their employer's unexpected guest. The library had become her refuge, a sanctuary lined with books in multiple languages that offered her a window into Jin Woo's mind. The collection was eclectic, ranging from classical Korean poetry to contemporary business strategy texts, with an entire section devoted to philosophy and ethics that seemed at odds with his chosen profession. She found herself wondering what kind of man surrounded himself with debates about morality while commanding an empire built on controlled violence. She was reaching for a volume of translated Confucian texts when her fingers slipped on the leather binding, sending the heavy book tumbling toward the marble floor. Her attempt to catch it resulted in a sharp collision between the book's corner and her left wrist, drawing a thin line of blood and a startled cry of pain that echoed in the library's quiet atmosphere. The sound of footsteps approaching made her look up to find Jin Woo standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from polite inquiry to focused concern as he took in the scene. He moved toward her with that same fluid grace she had noticed in the restaurant, but something in his manner was different, less predatory and more genuinely attentive to her injury. "Let me see," he said quietly, extending his hand in a gesture that was somehow both commanding and gentle. The contrast between his usual authoritative demeanor and this moment of unexpected tenderness caught her off guard, making her hesitate before offering her wounded wrist for his inspection. His touch was careful, clinical, as he examined the shallow cut with the focused attention of someone who understood the difference between minor injuries and serious wounds. His fingers were warm against her skin, and she found herself noticing details that had escaped her attention during their more formal interactions. The way his dark hair fell slightly across his forehead when he concentrated. The small scar at the corner of his left eye that spoke of violence survived. The surprising gentleness in hands that she knew were capable of terrible things. "It needs cleaning," he observed, his voice maintaining that same quiet tone that seemed reserved for moments when his usual armor of absolute control was not required. "Come." He led her through corridors she had not seen before, past rooms that held glimpses of a life more complex than she had imagined. A traditional Korean tea service arranged on a low table. Family photographs that had been carefully placed to catch morning light. Evidence of someone who maintained connection to culture and history even while operating in a world that seemed to exist outside conventional moral boundaries. The bathroom he brought her to was a study in modern luxury, all clean lines and expensive fixtures that managed to feel warm rather than sterile. He guided her to sit on the edge of a marble countertop while he gathered supplies from a cabinet that seemed surprisingly well stocked with medical necessities. "You do this often?" she asked, watching him prepare antiseptic and bandages with the efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. "Occupational hazard," he replied simply, beginning the careful process of cleaning her wound. His touch remained gentle, but she could feel the controlled strength beneath the surface, the careful modulation of power that allowed him to tend to something fragile without causing additional damage. The silence that followed felt different from the careful politeness that had marked their previous interactions. It was comfortable in a way that surprised her, intimate without being threatening, as if they had moved beyond the roles of captor and captive into something more fundamentally human. "You were a counselor," Jin Woo said as he applied the bandage with meticulous care. "Before Marcus. Before all of this." It was not really a question, and Zara found herself unsurprised that he knew details about her professional life that she had never shared. His knowledge of her past had become less shocking and more simply another aspect of the thorough preparation that seemed to characterize everything he did. "Crisis intervention," she confirmed, flexing her fingers to test his bandaging work. Mostly domestic violence cases, some addiction counseling. People who had lost control of their lives and needed help finding their way back. And now you find yourself in need of the same kind of intervention, he observed, his dark eyes meeting hers with a directness that made her uncomfortable in its perception. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of raised voices from somewhere in the compound interrupted their quiet moment. Jean Wu's expression immediately shifted back into the controlled mask of authority, but not before she caught a glimpse of something that looked like regret at the intrusion. They moved through the corridors toward the source of the disturbance, arriving at what appeared to be a security office where one of Jean Wu's associates was attempting to calm a young man who was clearly in severe emotional distress. The stranger was Korean, probably in his early 20s, and his agitation was escalating despite the increasingly firm attempts to manage his behavior. Zara recognized the signs immediately: the rapid breathing, the inability to focus on immediate surroundings, the way his hands shook as adrenaline flooded his system with fight-or-flight chemicals his rational mind could not process. This was not defiance or disrespect. This was trauma expressing itself in the only way it knew how. "He is having a panic attack," she said quietly to Jean Wu, who was observing the scene with the calculating expression of someone deciding how much patience to extend before implementing more direct solutions. Without waiting for permission, Zara approached the distressed young man with the calm, non-threatening manner she had learned through years of crisis intervention work. She positioned herself where he could see her clearly without feeling cornered, her body language open and unthreatening. "My name is Zara," she said in the steady, reassuring tone she had used hundreds of times before with people who felt like the world was spinning out of control. "I can see that you are frightened right now, and I want you to know that you are safe. Can you tell me your name?" The young man's eyes focused on her with the desperate intensity of someone grasping for an anchor in chaos. His breathing was still rapid, but some of the wildness in his expression began to subside as her presence registered as non-threatening. "Hyun-woo," he managed between gasps, his voice thick with an accent that suggested English was not his first language. "That is a good name," Zara said, settling into the rhythm of de-escalation that felt as natural as breathing. "Hyun-woo, I want you to breathe with me. In through your nose, hold for 3 counts, out through your mouth. Can you do that for me?" She guided him through the breathing exercises with the patient expertise of someone who understood that panic was not a rational state that could be argued with, only a physiological response that needed to be managed until it passed. Behind her, she was aware of Jean Wu and his security team watching the interaction with varying degrees of surprise and assessment. 20 minutes later, Hyun-woo was breathing normally and explaining in halting English how his younger sister had disappeared from their family's restaurant in Koreatown 3 days earlier, how the police had been dismissive of his concerns because she was over 18 and had a history of staying out late, how he had heard that Jean-woo sometimes helped people who had nowhere else to turn, and how desperation had driven him to show up at the compound gates demanding an audience. As Zara listened to his story, she became aware of Jean Wu's presence behind her, silent but attentive. When she finally turned to look at him, she found his dark eyes focused on her with an expression she could not immediately interpret. It was not the calculating assessment she had grown accustomed to, but something that looked almost like recognition. "You did well," he said simply, but the words carried a weight that suggested they meant more than simple approval. Later that evening, after Hyun-woo had been provided with both practical assistance in finding his sister and a standing invitation to return if he needed additional help, Zara found herself alone with Jean Wu in his private study. The room was a reflection of the man who occupied it, spare but elegant, with carefully chosen pieces that spoke of both power and refinement. "You surprised me today," he said, pouring 2 glasses of what appeared to be very expensive whiskey and offering one to her with the same courtesy he might show an equal rather than a protected asset. "How so?" she asked, accepting the glass but not drinking, still uncertain about the boundaries of their relationship and what accepting his hospitality might signal. "Most people in your situation would be focused entirely on their own survival," he replied, settling into the chair across from her with that same fluid grace that made even casual movements seem deliberate. "You saw someone in distress and your first instinct was to help." that suggests a character that is not easily broken. The words hung between them like a bridge across the careful distance they had been maintaining. Zara found herself studying his face in the soft light of the study, noting details that had escaped her attention during their more formal interactions. The way his shoulders carried a tension that never fully released, even in private. The shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleep that came infrequently and lightly. The careful way he held himself, as if relaxation was a luxury he could not afford. "You look tired," she said, the observation escaping before she could consider whether it was appropriate to comment on his appearance or well-being. Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the controlled facade that revealed a glimpse of the man beneath the armor of authority. For just a moment, he looked not like a dangerous crime lord but like someone who carried the weight of too many responsibilities and too few people he could trust with his vulnerability. "Sleep is a luxury that my position does not often allow," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised them both. "There are always threats to assess, decisions to make, consequences to manage. The price of control is constant vigilance." "That sounds lonely," Zara said softly, recognizing in his words the same isolation that had characterized her own life with Marcus, albeit expressed through very different circumstances. Jin Woo met her eyes with a directness that felt almost intimate in its honesty. "It is," he said simply. "Power is the most isolating force in the world. It attracts those who want to use you and repels those who might actually care about you as more than a useful tool." The admission hung between them like a confession, creating a moment of understanding that transcended their roles as protector and protected. She began to see past the dangerous reputation and controlled violence to the human cost of the life he had chosen, while he seemed to recognize in her not just someone in need of protection but someone who understood the weight of carrying other people's pain. The moment was interrupted by the discreet sound of his phone, a reminder that the outside world continued to exist and demand his attention. He glanced at the message with the practiced efficiency of someone who was never truly off duty, and she watched his expression shift back into the controlled mask of authority. "There has been a development," he said, his voice returning to that measured tone she had learned to associate with serious trouble. "Marcus has made contact with his creditors. They are offering additional resources to help him locate you. The situation is escalating more quickly than I anticipated." The spell of intimacy that had surrounded them shattered like glass, replaced by the cold reality of external threats that cared nothing for whatever understanding had begun to develop between them. Zara felt the cage walls closing around her again, but this time she also felt the presence of someone who understood exactly what those walls meant and why they were necessary. She was beginning to understand that Jin Woo's protection was not just about keeping her physically safe. It was about creating a space where someone like her, someone who had spent months walking on eggshells and measuring words for their potential to trigger violence, could exist without that constant tension. But she was also beginning to understand that accepting that protection meant sharing the isolation that came with his power, the careful distance that kept enemies from finding leverage through the people you cared about. As she returned to her room that night, Zara found herself thinking not about escape or freedom, but about the unexpected gentleness in hands that commanded violence and the loneliness in eyes that missed nothing. The man who had offered her protection was more complex than she had imagined, and the arrangement between them was beginning to feel less like captivity and more like something she did not yet have words to describe. The breaking point came during breakfast on her 7th day in the compound, when Zara discovered that her request to attend a professional development conference for crisis counselors had been denied without consultation. The registration materials she had completed lay on the dining room table with a polite but firm note explaining that public gatherings presented unacceptable security risks and alternative arrangements would be made to continue her education. The casual dismissal of her professional aspirations, delivered through intermediaries as if she were a child whose decisions required adult supervision, ignited something in Zara that a week of careful compliance had been building toward. She had accepted the compound's restrictions, adapted to the security protocols, even found herself appreciating the strange peace that came with being protected. But this felt like erasure of her identity rather than protection of her person. She found Jin Woo in his office, a space that reflected his dual nature with traditional Korean artwork hanging alongside modern technology that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. He looked up from a tablet displaying what appeared to be security footage as she entered without knocking, his expression shifting from concentration to polite attention to something approaching wariness as he registered her emotional state. "We need to discuss the boundaries of this arrangement," she said, her voice carrying the steady calm she had learned through years of managing volatile situations, while making it clear that she would not be deflected or dismissed. Jin-woo set down the tablet with the deliberate care of someone who recognized a significant conversation when it arrived unexpectedly. His dark eyes studied her face with that same analytical intensity she had grown accustomed to, but this time she met his gaze without flinching, making it clear that she was not asking for permission but demanding negotiation. "What specifically concerns you?" he asked, his tone maintaining that careful neutrality that could become either accommodation or immovable authority depending on how the conversation developed. "I am not your prisoner," Zara stated clearly, placing the conference denial on his desk like evidence in a case she intended to win. "I am not your possession to be managed and scheduled according to your convenience. I am a professional woman who entered into an arrangement for protection, not voluntary house arrest." The words hung between them with the weight of a direct challenge to his control, something she suspected did not happen often in his world. Jin-woo's expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was recalibrating his understanding of the woman sitting across from him. "The conference presents security risks that you are not equipped to assess," he replied, but his tone had lost some of its automatic authority and gained a note that suggested he was actually considering her position rather than simply dismissing it. "Then assess them with me," Zara countered, leaning forward to emphasize her engagement with the problem rather than simple resistance to his authority. "Explain the specific threats. Show me the intelligence that makes this event dangerous. Treat me like an intelligent adult who is capable of making informed decisions about acceptable risk rather than a fragile object that needs to be kept in storage until the world becomes safe." Jin-woo was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing something there that he had not noticed before. She could practically watch him weighing her words, considering whether her request represented reasonable negotiation or the first step toward unacceptable compromise of his security protocols. "Marcus has made contact with a faction that has been looking for ways to damage my organization," he said finally, his voice taking on the measured tone he used for briefings on serious threats. "They call themselves the Red Dragons, a collection of former associates who believe I have become too moderate in my business practices. They see helping him retrieve you as an opportunity to demonstrate that my protection is not as absolute as my reputation suggests." The information was delivered with clinical precision, but Zara could hear beneath it the weight of personal concern that went beyond simple professional obligation. This was not just about maintaining his reputation or protecting an asset. This was about something that had become personal in ways that probably surprised him as much as it did her. "Then we modify the approach," she said, meeting his strategy with strategy rather than simply accepting defeat. "Private venue instead of public conference. Limited attendance. Your security managing access points. But not total isolation. Not the complete erasure of my professional identity because it is convenient for your peace of mind." Jin-woo's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and she realized she was witnessing something rare in his world. He was being forced to accommodate someone else's needs while maintaining his own standards, to find compromise in a life that probably operated through absolute control more often than negotiation. "There would be conditions," he said finally, and she felt a small surge of victory at the implicit acknowledgement that her position had merit. "Extensive advanced security. Limited guest list subject to background verification. My people in positions to control every access point. At the first sign of threat, you leave immediately without argument." "Agreed," Zara said promptly, recognizing that this was as much compromise as she was likely to achieve and more than she had expected when the conversation began. The negotiation felt like a victory for both of them, a recognition that their arrangement could evolve beyond simple captor and captive into something more resembling partnership. But as they worked through the logistics of securing her participation in professional activities, Neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been conducting surveillance of the compound's gates for the past 3 days, or the telephoto lens documenting her routines through the bulletproof windows. The modified professional gathering took place 4 days later in a private conference room at one of Portland's most exclusive hotels, with Jean Woo's security team positioned as servers, hotel staff, and guests who maintained careful oversight of every person who entered the space. Zara felt a profound relief at being able to engage with her professional community again, to remember the parts of herself that existed independent of the strange new reality of her protected existence. The presentation on trauma-informed care techniques was exactly the kind of continuing education that would help her maintain her certification and expand her understanding of her field. She found herself taking notes with enthusiasm, asking questions, engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to calculate. For 2 hours, she felt like herself again rather than someone playing the role of a grateful refugee. She was leaving the conference room, still energized by the professional engagement and pleased by how smoothly the security arrangements had worked, when the server approaching with a tray of coffee moved with the wrong kind of precision. Her crisis counselor training had taught her to recognize behavioral anomalies, and something about his approach pattern triggered every alarm system in her mind. The realization that he was not actually serving refreshments came a split second before his hand moved toward what was definitely not a coffee pot. She threw herself sideways, shouting a warning that was lost in the explosion of sound and motion as Jean Woo's security team reacted with the lethal efficiency of predators who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The violence was over in seconds, but those seconds stretched like hours in Zara's memory. The fake server neutralized with brutal precision. The immediate evacuation of other conference attendees who had no idea they had just witnessed an assassination attempt. The controlled chaos of Jean Woo's team securing the scene and ensuring that no additional threats remained hidden among the hotel's legitimate staff. Jean Woo arrived as the immediate danger was being contained, and the expression on his face was unlike anything Zara had seen from him before. The controlled authority was still present, but beneath it was something cold and lethal that made his previous displays of power seem restrained by comparison. This was not the civilized businessman who had offered her protection or the surprisingly gentle man who had bandaged her cut. This was the predator that his enemies feared, fully unleashed and focused on the source of threat to something he protected. The interrogation of the captured assassin took place in a back room of the hotel with an efficiency that suggested this was not the first time Jean Woo's people had needed to extract information under pressure. Zara was not allowed to witness the process, but the results were shared with her in the same clinical tone Jean Woo used for all serious security briefings. Marcus had indeed made a deal with the Red Dragons, trading information about her location and routines in exchange for their assistance in retrieving her. But the faction had decided that simply returning her was insufficient payback for what they saw as Jean Woo's growing weakness. They wanted to demonstrate that his protection could be breached, that choosing to shelter someone outside his organization had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The failed assassination attempt had been designed not just to eliminate her but to humiliate him, to prove that his legendary control had limits and that those limits could be found through the people he chose to care about. It was a message delivered through violence that his enemies viewed his protection of her as both opportunity and weakness to be exploited. Back at the compound that evening, Zara sat in Jean Woo's study while he coordinated the response to what had clearly become an escalating conflict. She watched him manage communications with his security team, authorize actions against the Red Dragons that he described only in euphemisms, and implement protocols that would ensure no similar attempts could succeed. The efficiency with which he neutralized the threat was impressive and terrifying in equal measure. But what struck her most was the careful way he avoided looking directly at her while handling the crisis. As if her presence in the room represented a distraction he could not afford while dealing with threats that had materialized around her existence in his world. When he finally finished the evening's crisis management and turned his attention to her, she could see the cost of the day's events written in the tension around his eyes. "This was a mistake," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her chest tighten with something approaching panic. "I allowed personal considerations to override security protocols. I compromised the safety of everyone involved because I wanted to accommodate your request for normalcy." The words hit her like physical blows, Not because they were angry, but because they carried the resigned tone of someone who had reached a conclusion he did not want to accept. She realized that he was not just processing the failure of his security arrangements but questioning the entire foundation of their relationship. "You cannot blame yourself for other people's decisions to use violence," she said firmly, moving closer to him with the same calm determination she had shown during their earlier negotiation. "You provided security that worked. Your people identified the threat and neutralized it before anyone was seriously hurt. The only mistake was made by people who chose to put innocent lives at risk to make a point about power." Jinwoo looked at her with an expression that seemed almost surprised by her response, as if he had expected her to blame him for the danger or demand to be released from an arrangement that had clearly painted a target on her back. Instead, she was defending his actions and refusing to let him shoulder responsibility for threats created by his enemies. "You could have been killed today," he said, and she heard beneath the controlled tone something that sounded almost like anguish. "The thought of losing you to violence meant to hurt me is unacceptable." The admission hung between them like a bridge across the careful distance they had been maintaining, a recognition that somewhere in the process of protection and accommodation, something had developed between them that went far beyond simple security arrangements. She saw in his eyes not just the professional obligation to protect an asset but something personal and vulnerable that made her understand why he had withdrawn into crisis management mode rather than dealing with the emotional implications of the day's events. "I was not killed," she said softly, reaching out to touch his hand with the same gentle certainty he had shown when bandaging her wound. "I am here, safe, because your protection worked exactly as it was designed to work. The only people who should be questioning their choices tonight are the ones who decided that trying to hurt you through me was an acceptable strategy." The touch of her hand seemed to ground him in the present moment, pulling him back from whatever dark calculations he had been running about acceptable risk and protective obligations. For the first time since arriving at the hotel, he looked directly at her, and she saw in his dark eyes a vulnerability that probably few people ever witnessed. "When I saw that gun aimed at you," he said quietly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I understood something about myself that I did not expect to discover. You have become more than someone I am obligated to protect. You have become someone whose loss would change me in ways I am not prepared to handle." The confession settled between them like a weight too heavy for the careful boundaries they had established around their relationship. Zara felt her own defenses shifting in response to his honesty, recognizing in his words something that matched the growing attachment she had been trying not to examine too closely. She realized that somewhere in the process of accommodation and negotiation, of shared vulnerability and unexpected tenderness, she had stopped seeing him as her captor and started seeing him as something far more dangerous to her independence. She was beginning to care about him not just as the source of her protection but as a man whose loneliness matched her own, whose careful control masked the same kind of emotional wounds that had shaped her own approaches to survival. The knowledge that his enemies would continue to view her as leverage against him should have made her more afraid, should have sent her looking for escape routes and exit strategies. Instead, it made her more determined to prove that whatever was developing between them was strong enough to survive the attempts to weaponize it against them both. The deception was flawless in its simplicity. The message came through Jinwoo's encrypted communication system with all the proper authentication codes, requesting Zara's presence at a safe house in southeast Portland where Hyenwa's sister had been found and was refusing to speak to anyone except the counselor who had helped her brother. The security protocols were followed precisely, with her regular protection detail escorting her to the address provided by what appeared to be Jinwoo's intelligence network. She should have questioned why Jinwoo himself was not present for such a significant development. Should have noticed that the safe house looked more abandoned than secure. Should have recognized that the silence from her security team was wrong, that their responses to her questions carried the flat tone of men who were following scripts rather than reacting naturally to an evolving situation. But the possibility of helping another young woman who had disappeared into the city's predatory underground felt like a return to the professional purpose that had been stripped away by her circumstances. The chance to be useful again, to apply her skills in service of someone who needed them, overwhelmed the small warning voices that tried to surface in the back of her mind. The realization that she had been betrayed came too late to matter. The safe house was indeed a trap, but not one set by external enemies. Her own protection detail had been compromised, purchased by promises that probably seemed reasonable to men who viewed loyalty as a commodity that could be traded for the right price. Marcus stood in the empty living room with representatives of the Red Dragons flanking him, his smile carrying all the vindictive satisfaction of someone who had finally figured out how to win a game he had been losing. "Did you really think you could disappear into some crime lord's fantasy and leave me behind?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying that familiar edge of entitled rage that had terrorized her for months. "Did you think I would just accept that you chose him over me, chose his world over the life we built together?" The twisted logic that allowed him to characterize their relationship as something she had chosen rather than something she had endured made Zara's stomach clench with familiar nausea. But beneath the old fear was something new, something that surprised her with its intensity. She was not just afraid for herself. She was afraid for Jin Woo, for what her kidnapping would mean to a man whose enemies were using her as a weapon against him. The Red Dragons had planned this operation with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized organized crime at its most professional level. They had identified vulnerabilities in Jin Woo's security network, exploited personal loyalties that could be purchased or threatened, and created a scenario that would draw her away from the compound's defenses into a location where she could be taken without the kind of open warfare that would invite unwanted attention from law enforcement. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that Jin Woo's attachment to her was a weakness to be exploited rather than a force of nature to be feared. They had treated his protection of her as evidence of growing softness rather than recognition of the absolute determination that defined every aspect of his character. They were about to learn the difference between a man who was weakened by caring and a man who was rendered limitless by it. The first sign that their plan had gone wrong came 47 minutes after Zara failed to check in at her scheduled time. The silence from her security team lasted exactly 3 minutes beyond acceptable parameters before Jin Woo's response began to unfold with the systematic precision of a military operation designed by someone who had never learned to accept defeat. The compromised members of her protection detail were located within 20 minutes. Their betrayal extracted through interrogation techniques that left them willing to provide every detail of the Red Dragon's operation, including GPS coordinates, personnel counts, and the specific timeline for moving her to a secondary location. The intelligence gathering phase of the rescue took 38 minutes. The tactical planning took 12. The execution began at sunset with the kind of overwhelming force that had built Jin Woo's reputation among people who understood the mathematics of organized violence. Zara heard the assault begin from the basement where she had been secured while Marcus and his allies prepared for what they believed would be a negotiation conducted from a position of strength. The sound of breaking glass was followed by percussion grenades designed to disorient rather than kill. Then the methodical advance of professionals who had conducted similar operations enough times to move with lethal efficiency through unfamiliar terrain. The gunfire was brief and decisive. The Red Dragons had prepared for a siege, but found themselves facing a surgical strike that neutralized their defensive positions before they fully understood they were under attack. Jin Woo's people moved through the safe house with the coordinated precision of predators who had been given permission to hunt, eliminating threats with minimal waste of ammunition or time. Marcus's bravado evaporated the moment he understood that his careful plan was collapsing around him with the inevitability of natural law. The man who had terrorized Zara through months of escalating abuse discovered that real power looked nothing like the petty cruelty he had mistaken for strength. When Jin Woo himself appeared in the basement doorway, Marcus seemed to shrink physically in the presence of someone who commanded violence rather than simply wielding it. Jin Woo moved through the basement with the controlled fury of a man who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of his considerable patience. His expression held no trace of the careful politeness or unexpected gentleness that Zara had grown accustomed to seeing. This was the predator that his enemies feared, fully unleashed and focused on eliminating threats with the same clinical precision he brought to all aspects of his professional life. The execution of Marcus was swift and final, conducted with the sort of professional detachment that spoke of someone who viewed violence as a necessary tool rather than an emotional outlet. But when Jin Woo turned to the Red Dragon operative who had planned the kidnapping, something in his manner shifted into territory that made even his own people look away. This was not just about neutralizing a threat. This was about sending a message that would prevent future attempts to use the people he protected as weapons against him. The rescue itself took less than 18 minutes from first breach to final elimination of hostile forces. But the aftermath stretched like an eternity as Jinwoo cut through the restraints that had secured her to a chair in the basement. His hands gentle despite the violence they had just orchestrated. The contrast between his careful touch and the efficiency with which he had eliminated her captors created a cognitive dissonance that left her struggling to process the events that had just unfolded around her. "You are safe," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority or control she had grown accustomed to, just exhausted relief and something that sounded almost like grief. "They cannot hurt you anymore." The simple statement seemed inadequate to encompass the magnitude of what had just occurred, the systematic destruction of everyone who had threatened her and the demonstration of resources and capabilities that she was only beginning to understand. But as she looked into his dark eyes, she saw something that made her realize the cost of her rescue went beyond the violence that had been necessary to secure it. He had been afraid, not strategically concerned or professionally worried, but genuinely terrified in a way that had probably not happened to him in years. The thought of losing her had stripped away all the careful emotional armor he wore, revealing something vulnerable and desperate that he probably had not shown to anyone in his adult life. "I thought I had lost you," Jinwoo admitted as he helped her to her feet, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When I realized they had taken you from a location I thought was secure, using people I trusted to protect you, I understood that I had failed at the only thing that mattered." The confession hit her with more impact than the violence that had preceded it, forcing her to confront emotions she had been trying not to examine too closely. She realized that somewhere in the process of accommodation and compromise, of shared vulnerability and unexpected connection, she had stopped thinking about escape and started thinking about partnership. She had stopped seeing their arrangement as temporary protection and started seeing it as the foundation for something permanent. When she looked at him now, she did not see the dangerous man who had forced her into his world through circumstances beyond her control. She saw the man who had just demonstrated that her safety mattered more to him than his own reputation, who had mobilized every resource at his disposal to bring her home, who was looking at her now with an expression that made her understand exactly what she had become to him. "I was afraid too," she said softly, surprising them both with the admission. "Not just for myself, but for what my disappearance would do to you. I was afraid that they would succeed in hurting you through me, that my presence in your life had created the vulnerability they needed to damage you." Jinwoo studied her face with that same intense focus she had grown accustomed to, but this time she met his gaze without reservation, letting him see the depth of her concern for his well-being and the realization that her feelings for him had evolved far beyond gratitude for protection or appreciation for his unexpected gentleness. "You care about me," he said, and the wonder in his voice suggested that this was not an outcome he had anticipated when he first offered her sanctuary from Marcus's threats. "I care about you," she confirmed, stepping closer to him despite the scent of gunpowder and violence that still clung to his clothes. "I care about what happens to you, about the cost of protecting me, about the way you look when you think no one is watching and you let your guard down for just a moment." The admission hung between them like a bridge across the careful distance they had maintained throughout their arrangement, an acknowledgement that what had started as a transaction born of necessity had become something neither of them had planned for but both were beginning to recognize as essential to their futures. In the car returning to the compound, Zara found herself studying Jinwoo's profile as he coordinated the cleanup of the evening's operation and implemented new security protocols designed to prevent similar breaches. She was beginning to understand that accepting his protection had never really been about choosing the lesser of two evils or finding temporary shelter until better options emerged. She was beginning to understand that she was falling in love with a man whose world was built on controlled violence and careful isolation, and that her presence in his life was changing both of them in ways they were only starting to comprehend. The compound gates closed behind them with the familiar sound of security being restored, but for the first time since accepting Jinwoo's protection, Zara did not feel like she was returning to a beautiful prison. She felt like she was coming home to a man who would level entire organizations to keep her safe, and who was beginning to trust her with the parts of himself that he had kept carefully hidden from a world that viewed vulnerability as weakness to be exploited. She was no longer running from her past or simply accepting protection from an uncertain future. She was choosing a life with a man whose love was expressed through absolute devotion, and whose protection had become inseparable from the security she had been searching for all along. The most dangerous thing that had happened to her was not the kidnapping or the violence that had rescued her from it. The most dangerous thing was the realization that she no longer wanted to be anywhere else. The morning after the rescue dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the bulletproof windows of Jean Wu's compound with the kind of crystalline beauty that made the previous night's violence seem like something from another world entirely. Zara woke to the scent of coffee and the quiet sounds of a household returning to normal rhythms after crisis. But beneath the surface calm, she could feel the weight of unfinished conversations and decisions that could no longer be postponed. She found Jean Wu in his private study, still wearing the clothes from the night before, surrounded by reports and communication devices that suggested he had spent the hours since her rescue ensuring that every loose thread from the Red Dragon's operation had been identified and addressed. He looked up when she entered, and she saw in his expression the same careful assessment that had characterized their early interactions, as if he was no longer certain what their relationship meant now that the immediate threat had been eliminated. The external justification for their arrangement had been removed with Marcus's death and the systematic dismantling of the Red Dragon faction that had allied with him. The intelligence report spread across Jean Wu's desk confirmed what they both already understood. There were no remaining credible threats to her safety, no outstanding debts or vengeful associates who might view her as valuable leverage. She was free to return to her former life if that was what she chose, free to walk away from the compound and the man who had protected her without concern for pursuit or retaliation. The realization that she could leave should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the life she had known before and wondering why it seemed so much smaller and less substantial than the dangerous partnership she had discovered in his world. "We need to talk about what comes next," Jean Wu said quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority she had grown accustomed to hearing. This was not the crime lord issuing directives or the protector establishing security protocols. This was a man who had spent the night confronting his own vulnerability and was no longer certain what he had the right to ask for. "Yes, we do," Zara agreed, settling into the chair across from his desk with the same calm determination that had characterized her challenge to his authority days earlier. But this time her resolve was focused not on establishing boundaries but on dismantling the careful distance that circumstances had forced them to maintain. "You are free to go," Jean Wu said, and she heard beneath the formal politeness something that sounded almost like grief. "The threats that brought you here have been eliminated. Your safety no longer requires my protection. You can return to your life, your work, your independence, without concern for the complications that come with my world." The words were clearly prepared, probably rehearsed during the long hours he had spent processing intelligence reports and avoiding the emotional implications of her rescue. But his dark eyes told a different story, revealing a man who was offering her freedom while hoping desperately that she would choose something else entirely. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly, studying his face for signs of the vulnerability he had shown her in moments of crisis. "Do you want me to leave, to return to a life that feels like it belongs to someone else now that I understand what it means to be protected by someone who would move mountains to keep me safe?" The question hung between them like a challenge, forcing him to confront the careful emotional armor he had been rebuilding since bringing her home. She watched him struggle with the admission, with the recognition that somewhere in the process of protecting her, he had allowed her to become essential to his own sense of completeness. "What I want is irrelevant," Jean Wu said finally, but his voice lacked conviction, carrying the hollow tone of someone reciting words he did not believe. "You deserve a life that is not defined by the violence and isolation that characterizes my world. You deserve safety that does not require constant vigilance, relationships that are not complicated by the enemies that my choices have created." The noble self-sacrifice in his words might have been touching if it had not been so fundamentally misguided about what she actually needed or wanted. Zara leaned forward, fixing him with the direct gaze she had learned to use when cutting through the defenses that trauma survivors use to protect themselves from hope. "What if what I deserve and what I want are not the same thing?" she asked, her voice carrying the steady conviction of someone who had spent months examining her own motivations and desires. What if the safety I was looking for was never about avoiding danger but about finding someone whose protection feels like partnership rather than control? Jin Woo's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the desperate hope he had been trying to suppress since the moment he had cut through her restraints in the Red Dragon's safe house. She could see him struggling with the possibility that she might choose to stay not because she had no other options but because she had found something in his world that she had never discovered anywhere else. "I am not a good man, Zara," he said quietly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The things I have done, the methods I used to maintain control, the enemies I have created through the choices that built my empire, none of that disappears because you have taught me what it means to care about someone more than my own survival." She rose from her chair and moved around the desk to stand directly in front of him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes and the careful way he held himself even in private moments when his guard should have been lowered. This was the man who had shown her unexpected gentleness while commanding absolute authority, who had bandaged her minor wounds with the same hands that had eliminated threats to her safety with lethal efficiency. "I am not looking for a good man," she said softly, reaching out to touch his face with the same careful tenderness he had shown her during moments of vulnerability. "I am looking for a man who understands what it means to choose someone completely, to offer protection that feels like devotion rather than obligation, to build something together that is stronger than the sum of its parts." The touch of her hand seemed to ground him in the present moment, pulling him away from whatever dark calculations about worthiness and risk he had been running throughout the long night. When he looked at her now, she saw not the careful assessment of threats and opportunities, but the naked honesty of someone who had stopped trying to protect himself from the possibility of love. "Stay with me," Jin Woo said, and the words carried the weight of absolute commitment despite their simplicity. "Not because you need my protection or because the world outside these walls is too dangerous to navigate alone, but because you choose this life, this partnership, this future that we could build together." The declaration hung between them like a bridge across the careful boundaries they had maintained throughout their arrangement, an acknowledgement that what had begun as necessity had become something both of them recognized as essential to their happiness. She saw in his eyes not just desire but the kind of fundamental recognition that meant he understood exactly what he was asking and what he was offering in return. "Yes," Zara said simply, the word carrying all the certainty that months of careful consideration had given her. "Yes, I choose you, I choose this life, I choose the partnership we have been building even when we were both too afraid to acknowledge what it was becoming." The kiss that sealed their commitment was gentle and desperate in equal measure, a recognition of how close they had come to losing each other and a promise that they would not allow external threats or internal fears to separate them again. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, both looking at each other with the wonder of people who had found something they had not known they were searching for. The practical arrangements that followed felt like the natural evolution of decisions they had already made in their hearts. Zara's professional credentials would be maintained through carefully structured continuing education and consulting work that allowed her to help people without exposing herself to unnecessary risk. Jin Woo's world would be modified to accommodate a partner whose insights into human psychology could strengthen the organization while maintaining the moral boundaries that defined her character. The symbolic claiming came in the form of a platinum ring that managed to be both elegantly simple and unmistakably expensive, a piece of jewelry that announced commitment without drawing unwanted attention. But more meaningful than the ring was the way Jin Woo introduced her to his associates as his partner rather than his protected asset. The subtle shift in language that signaled to his world that she had moved from temporary arrangement to permanent fixture in his life. As you think about this story of two people who found love in the most unlikely circumstances, I want you to consider the moments when someone has offered you protection that felt like genuine care rather than control. Think about the times when you have chosen to trust someone despite the risks, when you have discovered that the most dangerous thing you can do is open your heart to someone who has the power to change your life completely. Share in the comments what moments of unexpected protection or surprising love have shaped your own story, because the best romances are always about finding sanctuary in someone else's strength. The compound that had once felt like a beautiful prison now felt like home in the truest sense. A place where two people who had learned to survive alone could build something together that was stronger than either of them could achieve in isolation. The external threats that had brought them together were permanently neutralized, but the connection they had forged through crisis had evolved into something that could weather whatever challenges the future might bring. 6 months later, Zara woke to the scent of sandalwood and coffee, to the quiet sounds of Jin Woo conducting business in 3 languages from his study, to the profound peace that came from knowing that the most dangerous man in Portland would level entire organizations to keep her safe. She had found her sanctuary not in escape from the world's dangers, but in partnership with someone who understood that true protection meant creating space for the person you love to flourish rather than simply survive. The morning light streaming through their bedroom windows illuminated a life that neither of them had planned but both had chosen completely. She was no longer the woman who had fled through rainy streets hoping to escape one form of captivity. She was the partner of a man who had taught her that the right kind of cage was not a prison but a sanctuary, not a limitation but a foundation for the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Jin Woo looked up from his morning briefings as she entered his study, and the smile that crossed his face was the same expression of wonder and gratitude that had characterized the moment she had chosen to stay rather than leave. They had found each other in the space between protection and partnership, between safety and love, between the careful isolation that had defined their separate lives and the dangerous intimacy that would define their shared future. The world outside the compound remained exactly as threatening and unpredictable as it had always been, but they would navigate its challenges together, 2 people who had discovered that the most powerful force in any dangerous world was the absolute certainty that someone would fight for your happiness as fiercely as they fought for their own.